Responsibility annuls the call to which it seeks to respond. What is it, then, to be responsible to a changeful thought on the question of responsibility? What could be the responsibility toward a consistent discourse which claimed to show that no responsibility could ever be taken without equivocation and without contradiction? To open an essay with such a question is perhaps already to betray the ideal of academic responsibility in which one was trained. That ideal was to give an objective account of an argument with textual demonstrations and subsequently to evaluate it on its own terms as well as by the standards of an impartial judgment. By comparison with the imperatives of that austere responsibility, the first years of this writer's teaching career, which began in 1965, seemed to be haunted by demands of an extreme irresponsibility towards the impersonality of history and augury. Do we like it? Is that relevant to us? And then to me? To open an essay with the question of responsibility to a thought, precisely of responsibility, from which a lesson of responsibility is learned, goes against the grain of both of these imperatives. For it is, first, to show that one is already partisan, and secondly, it is to reveal that one's anxiety is for one's responsibility to the text, not the other way around. Yet, is there not something like a resemblance between those imperatives, requiring objectivity toward or relevance from the text, and my opening question? For have we not guessed that the early lesson of disinterested objectivity was, in fact, an unacknowledged partisanship to a sort of universalist humanism, which dictated that one show, even if by the way and by default, that the literary or philosophical text in general is good? And as for the other, does one not, given the current demand for the justification of an interest in deconstructive philosophical speculation in a politically inclined female migrant, demonstrate again and again its relevance to such inclinations and such provenance? How then to be responsible to the warning for a community of well-meaning deconstructionists, reassured and reconciled with the world in ethical certainty, good conscience, satisfaction of services rendered, and still the consciousness of duty accomplished, or more heroically still yet to be accomplished? Or to the reminder that it is especially when the philosopher, or anyone, tries and tries to explain and reveal, and the respondent tries and tries to receive the explanation and the revelation, that the something that must of necessity not go through is the secret and changeable essence of that exchange? Perhaps there is no answer to this question, but the constant attempt to let oneself be approached by the resistance which the thinking of responsibility may offer thought. Perhaps to be responsible to the question of responsibility is not to resist what will have happened, that the readers will have judged necessarily with, and in spite of, standards, necessarily related and different. In this, the thought of responsibility is a more affirmative formulation of what was written 30 years ago. Thought is the blank part of the text. If deconstruction comes tangled with responsibility to the trace of the other, the reader stands in here as the indefinite narrow sense of that radically other which cannot even have or be a face. For this reader, the difficult giving of permission to be approached by that which resists thought is susceptible to a literal translation, with all the necessity and impossibility that translation calls for, and by which it is called. This specific translation in this essay takes off from a literal understanding of statements such as the following: these new responsibilities cannot be purely academic. Between the principle of reason and anarchy, only the setting to work, mise en œuvre, of this thought can decide. To claim to eliminate that risk by an institutional program is quite simply to erect a barricade against a future. One attempts, then, to set the thought of responsibility to work in ways that are not purely academic. The peculiar contextualities of the theaters where each of these attempts is made inscribe an experience of the necessity of such translations and their impossibility. These experiences also teach how conservative it is to remain content with radical institutional programs. Not being a philosopher by talent and training, I cannot philosophize the delicate ruptures involved in the brutality of these literal translations. The more profound speculation would look upon the right of non-knowledge and non-rule, in which all decisions are taken, even when it is the most detailed knowledge that has been set most responsibly to work. This sentence already begs the question of responsibility, assumes its nature known. The space of this essay may be distinguished from those more perilous watches as the quicker tempo of the eve and the morning after of that night, the night of non-knowledge, when a just decision tears time, the time of effect following just cause. What the two spaces share is that the limit of the formalization of a problematic is a sort of intermediary stage. This is perhaps one way of being responsible to the thinking of responsibility, that whatever is formalizable remains in a sort of intermediary stage. The rest cannot be purely formalized. These steps must be formally taken and experienced as limits before the usual beginnings can be made. Full formalization itself must be seen not as impossible, but as an experience of the impossible, or a figure for the impossible, which may be, to say, the same thing. I can formalize responsibility in the following way. It is that all action is undertaken in response to a call, or something that seems to us to resemble a call, that cannot be grasped as such. Response here involves not only respond to, as in give an answer to, but also the related situations of answering to, as in being responsible for a name. This brings up the question of the relationship between being responsible for/to ourselves and for/to others, of being answerable for, all of which Derrida presents within the play in French between répondre à and répondre de. It is also, when it is possible for the other to be face-to-face, the task and lesson of attending to her responsibility so that it can draw forth one's own. I believe both Derrida and Luce Irigaray have seen the psychoanalytic model at its impossible best to accede to this sense of responsibility. With this formalization of the problematic of responsibility, seen as an intermediary stage, caught between an ungraspable call and a setting to work, this essay will offer two readings, of Derrida's Of Spirit and of the Conference on the World Bank's Flood Action Plan in Bangladesh. My readings will insist that the thinking of responsibility is also a thinking of contamination. If one will, then, seem to have shown that deconstruction is relevant to what is called the political sphere, after all, it will be the moment to ask you to remember that such demonstrations can only happen within the intermediary stage. 1. Of Spirit, Heidegger and the Question. Of all the texts of Derrida that I have read, this seems to me to be the one that assumes in the reader a careful and intimate reading of all the texts on method that have come before, a familiarity with a specialized vocabulary that might otherwise seem deceptively metaphorical or transparent. It is, therefore, a secretive text, both in the colloquial and in the Derridian sense. In the first sense, because it seems to guard its own secret, it is difficult to understand. To be a careless speed reader, it will even provide confirmation of stock responses. In the second sense, because even though to the responsive reader the text wishes to reveal itself in the full, it still seems to leave the reader with questions. There is nothing authorized about the reading I offer below, and especially about the reasons that I submit for the secretness of the text. Indeed, I have not tried to pry out the secret before referring to less secretive writings by Derrida on the Heidegger question. The secrecy of the secret does not disappear with the revelation. The secret never allows itself to be captured or covered over by the relation to the other, by being with, or by any form of social bond. No responsiveness. One of the reasons for the secretiveness may be the impossibility of a fully justified position of accusation. In one respect, Of Spirit traces Heidegger's seeming failure of responsibility towards his own thinking. In Being and Time, Heidegger had found it prudent to keep the questions of the spirit open, broachable only with quotation marks, if at all. Already in the opening pages of the text, Derrida suggests, in fact, Heidegger's entire earlier philosophy was dependent upon a question of the spirit that was merely avoided or foreclosed. The spirit works away at the text, finally to emerge with a terrifying role, perhaps precisely because its question had been avoided. Toward the end of section 5, Derrida demonstrates this with a reference to the rectoral address. Suddenly, with a single blow, the lifting of the quotation marks the raising of the curtain, the entry on stage of spirit itself. 6 years later, and here we have the rectorship address. I take responsibility for extrapolating this from closely orchestrated prose. Here, for the first time, Derrida writes, Heidegger defines spirit. The definition is not in contradiction with being in time, for spirit still does not seem to belong to subjectivity, at least in its psychical or ego-logical form. We are not speaking, in other words, of the human spirit, even in the most metaphysical sense. Thus, by appealing to such a spiritual force, unattached to the merely human, the address may seem no longer to belong simply to the ideological camp in which one appeals to obscure forces, forces which would not be spiritual but natural, biological, racial, according to an anything but spiritual interpretation of earth and blood. But, and this is why we must proceed cautiously, every comparable gesture turns back against its subject, against, if I may say so, its agent, for one must use this word in fact, because one cannot demarcate oneself from biologicism, from racism in its genetic form. One cannot be opposed to them, except by reinscribing spirit in an oppositional determination. Thus, one binds the philosophical apartness of spirit by determining it into a narrow sense as that which is the opposite of biologicism or genetic racism. It loses its non-character of guarding question. Hence, it no longer remains prior to, or outside of, all differences between subject and whatever is not subject. It belongs to the subjects, who rallies, or rally, in its name. It becomes negotiable. It is made to take a side, and thus becomes unilateral. Thus, reinscribing spirit in an oppositional demarcation once again makes it an unilaterality of subjectivity, even if, especially in its voluntarist form. This constraint reigns over the majority of discourse, which today and for a long time, he cannot say forever, to come, state their opposition to racism, to totalitarianism, to Nazism, to fascism, etc., and do this in the name of an axiomatic, for example, that of democracy or human rights, which, directly or not, comes back to this metaphysics of subjectivity. The only choice is the choice between the terrifying contaminations it assigns. Even if all forms of complicity are not equivalent, they are irreducible. The question of knowing which is the least grave of these forms of complicity is always there. Its urgency and its seriousness could not be overstressed, but it will never dissolve the irreducibility of this fact. It calls more than ever, as for what it remains to come after the disasters that have happened, for absolutely unprecedented responsibilities of thought and action. I have quoted this passage at such length because it should be read carefully and slowly. No academic eager to take sides in thought, cleanly without any active responsibility, wants to acknowledge the final and irreducible complicity between all unilateral binding of the spirit in a single cause. All sustained activists know that victories are warnings, without being able to articulate it philosophically, and often silencing that knowledge in the interest of the decision. Derrida attempts to deconstruct the gap. It is not that we must not take sides. We must continue to know and to make known which is the least grave of these forms of complicity. It is just that the decisive testing of the intellectually clear thought, which can construct systemic ways and means of avoiding logical risks to the fine-tuning of knowledge, must therefore be in action, the element of which is the risky right of non-knowledge. This is a position against the vanguardism of theory, not against risk-taking. It is not heroic enough for the armchair left liberals, but for those of us who have seen Gandhi's Ram Rajya, the kingdom of Rama, where, to give Gandhi the benefit of a doubt that he did not perhaps fully deserve, Rama was a nomination of the spirit of indigenous democracy, become the excuse for a state on the brink of a fascism committed to the genocide of Muslims, and who have seen Marx's project of the proletarians' collective use of reason, class consciousness, where rationality is the nomination of the human spirit, become an imperialism that, in postcoloniality, hankers after an underdeveloped capitalism as an alternative to genocide, and for those of us who daily see the covert and overt violence regularly practiced by the ideological and systemic manipulation of rational principles, such as due process, human rights, and democracy, these warnings must be taken seriously. We cannot necessarily assume, however implicitly, that the European-style invocation of spirit is uncontaminated, whereas other invocations of spirit are by definition ignorant or fundamentalist. The passage I have quoted is hard to understand only if the lessons of history, the disasters that have happened, have not been heeded. Indeed, inspirational academic heroics must resist understanding here. The implacable logic of the terrifying contamination is doing its supplementary labor in these becomings, these happenings. A responsible thought describes responsibility, caught in a question necessarily begged in action, is attending to the call of that irreducible fact. This is a practical position, an elaboration of the earlier position that, in effect, practice norms theory. As a practical academic, it is my unauthorized conviction that it is because of this academic resistance to acknowledgement of complicity that Derrida writes this most painful text in a language that must be learned. In other words, it may be accessible to a reading that is responsible to the text. The steps in such a reading are laid out in Paul Celan's Search for Lents embedded in Shibboleth. But why is this text painful? I think because, in a sense, more restricted than the general position outlined above, deconstruction cannot not acknowledge complicity with Heidegger. Precisely because of responsibility, Derrida cannot, and indeed will not, unlike Richard Rorty, simply separate the man from the work. I have been arguing, in a certain way, that Derrida's a teaching language, and indeed that is what Derrida says of the Heidegger of the rectoral address. Here we have a teaching language. No more than in 1933 does it rehabilitate the concept of spirit deconstructed in Sein und Zeit. But it is still in the name of the spirit that guides in resolution toward the question, the will to know and the will to essence, that the other spirit, its bad double, the phantom of subjectivity, turns out to be warded off by means of destruction. I have been spelling out so far that, according to Derrida, the phantom of subjectivity cannot be warded off. Indeed, that is the responsibility Heidegger gives up, and thus moves relentlessly towards unilaterality. This unilaterality has a bad trajectory because the philosophy of destruction cannot be used to ward off accountability, answerability, responsibility as a répondre de. It can only ever be a reminder of its open-ended and irreducible risk. You will remember that between the journal and the book form publication of De la Grammatologie, Derrida changed the word destruction to déconstruction. Heidegger's case demonstrates why destruction, as task, must not be used to ward off responsibility, but rather, as event, must be acknowledged as a reminder of how we are written. Unable as we are, and should be, not to take sides, Derrida is therefore also speaking of the folly of doing deconstruction as if it were fully under our control. This, of course, also relates to the conviction that the decisive ethico-political evaluation of thought is not self-contained, but is in its setting to work. In other words, paradoxically, impossibly, yet necessarily, in the setting to work, deconstruction may be bound to good or bad uses. This is the double bind of deconstruction, its peculiar humility, responsibility, and strength, its acknowledgement of radical contamination. It can be undertaken by someone who has learned it to philosophize with it against philosophy. Even knowing it is not enough, just as knowing the rules of a card game does not mean you have learned to play it well. Deconstruction is caught between the high rollers of the establishment who, without the patience or training to read the material carefully, congratulate themselves on having discovered its lack of moral muscle, and the defenders who claim it learnedly for philosophy, disowning its dependence on the unphilosophical or diagnosing the latter as simply literature, and those who do correct politics with it. But Nazism is a consequence that requires a careful reckoning of the lesson of deconstruction, not a denunciation that will please academics, but also not a defense that will endorse the two different kinds of defenders. It is in this position that Derrida writes for those who will read with care. We must not forget that the object of his investigation is still a speech that is given at a university, and the point of his critique is that destruction cannot be used to ward off the dangers of the necessary unilateral subject. Before we could pursue the critique further, it might be therefore pertinent to quote another statement of it in a speech given by Derrida himself at Columbia University, where he spoke of the responsibility of the academic in a modern university, necessarily imbricated within the structures of a post-industrial managerial society. One can doubt doubtless decenter the subject, as is easily said, without retesting the bond between, on the one hand, responsibility, and on the other, freedom of subjective consciousness or purity of intentionality. Heidegger, in using destruction as if he could control it, bypasses this challenge with murderous consequences, the armchair deconstructor decentering his or her subject at will, denies the prior axiomatics en bloc, and keeps it going as a survivor, with minor adjustments de rigueur and daily compromises lacking in rigor. So coping, so operating at top speed, one accounts and becomes accountable for nothing, not for what happens, not for the reasons to continue assuming responsibilities without a concept. How would it be if a fully deconstructive or destructive text could be produced? Its surface would be given over to an animal machine, a figure of evil. Let us pursue this enigmatic pronouncement. In the section that follows, the passages we have been reading, Derrida reads Heidegger as the latter names the animal and exposes a humanist teleology for Heidegger's deconstruction of ontology. Let us focus on the comment on that most Heideggerian/Derridian gesture, the sugature. It might be thought of as a gesture of warding off, keeping a thing visible but crossed out to avoid universalizing or monumentalizing it. As we have been reading it, this gesture can only be used, indeed must be performed in deconstruction as task in view of deconstruction as event, in the form of a warning of an irreducibility outside of intentional control, rather than a controlled gesture of saving oneself from the worst consequences of that irreducibility. As in Heidegger's implicit reliance upon destruction in the rectoral address, the gesture in Heidegger's Zur Seinsfrage seems not inconsonant with this. Heidegger proposes to write off the word being under a line of erasure in the form of a cross, kreuzweise Durchstreichung. This cross did not represent either a negative sign, or even a sign at all, but it was supposed to recall the Gewirrt, the fourfold, precisely as the play of the world, which, recalled in this way by an erasing of being, allows the department of, the becoming world of the world. It means in this case that one cannot derive or think the world starting from anything else but it. But look at this other proposition of crossing through, Durchstreichung, from 25 years earlier. And we flash back to the animal. I will attempt the daunting task of summarizing Derrida's itinerary. Derrida deduces a certain anthropomorphic or even humanist teleology in the thinking of Dasein, in view of the difference between the animal's privation, Entbehrung, from Dasein's privation, in comprehension of the world. The animal lacks access to the entity as such, as if the being of the entity were crossed out in advance, but with an absolute crossing out, that of privation. This is not the philosophical crossing out that the philosopher must practice to recall that design cannot get behind the worlding. It is a crossing through of the crossing through, or being crossed through. Further, the animal can be after a prey. It can calculate, hesitate, follow, or try out a track, but it cannot properly question. It can use things, even instrumentalize them, but it cannot gain access to techne. Thus, in terms of the question and of technology, design's definitive predications, it is always a matter of making an absolute limit between Dasein and the animal. Yet the lizard, Heidegger's example, does have a relationship with the sun and with the stone, Heidegger's example of the non-living, which itself has none. Derrida extends the set, or ensemble, that predicates the animal. We should now have to say of spirit what one says of the world for the animal. The animal is poor in spirit, geistarm, as it is, weltarm, as it were. It has spirit, but it does not have spirit, and this not having is a mode of its not being able to have spirit. It is important that the animal is absolutely off limits to the deconstruction of ontology. Heidegger can only mention, not use, the animal crossing through, or rather his philosophy is used by it, although he implies a negative hierarchization and evaluation by using the words poverty and lack, Entbehrung, about the animal. What is signaled by this animal crossing through, if we can call it that? Or rather, what is signaled by the word crossing through, which we write apropos of the animal world, and which ought, in its logic, to overtake all words from the moment they say something about the world? for the animal has some relationship with the world, and yet the animal is absolutely marked off from Dasein. Therefore, every inauguration of the world by Dasein is struck through by the inaccessible animal. Heidegger's philosophy responds against its grain to the animal by the formalizable logic of contamination, not just a threat, but a compromise. Can one not say, then, that the whole deconstruction of ontology as it is begun in Sein und Zeit, and insofar as it unseats, as it were, the Cartesian Hegelian spiritus in the existential analytic, is here threatened in its order, in its implementation, its conceptual apparatus, by what is called, so obscurely still, the animal? Compromised, rather, by a thesis on animality in general, for which any example would do the job. These difficulties, such at least is the proposition I submit for discussion, bring the consequences of a serious mortgaging, hypothetique. The word for a large mortgage loan, taken out, for instance, to finance the purchase of a house, to weigh upon the whole of his thought. This is an indictment, and Derrida stands behind it. Such is the proposition I submit. It may be remembered that the discussion of correct politics began in the impossibility of avoiding the unilaterality of the subjectity. In Derrida's reading, that is one of Heidegger's major philosophical irresponsibilities in the period of the rectoral address, to try to ward off that unilaterality by way of crossing through of destruction. In this chapter we see the epoch of, both the era of, and the bracketed-in philosophical region of, subjectivity, given the adjective Cartesian Hegelian. And, in the passage quoted at length, the deconstruction of ontology, insofar as it unseats the Cartesian Hegelian spiritus, by withdrawing it from subjectivity, is claimed to be threatened, or rather compromised, by the animal. It is in this context that Derrida brings up the question of a specifically political responsibility, and again, between the stone and design, the animal is the living creature. Privative poverty indeed marks the caesura, or the heterogeneity between non-living and living on the one hand, between the animal and the human Dasein on the other. This absolute limit between the living creature and the human Dasein takes a distance not only from all biologism and even all philosophy of life, and thus from all political ideology which might draw an inspiration more or less directly from them, but also from a Rilkean thematics which links openness and animality, not to mention Nietzsche. Derrida does not mention Nietzsche much in this book, but here is one indication why. For him, Nietzsche remains a less dark figure, because he reckons with the living animality of the human. As for Heidegger, Derrida asks, what is being for death? What is death for a Dasein that is never defined essentially as a living thing? This is not a matter of opposing death to life, but of wondering what semantic content can be given to death in a discourse for which the relation to death, the experience of death, remains unrelated to the life of the living thing. It is not only that destruction cannot be used to avoid the unilaterality of the subjectivity when spirit is bound by a stand taken in its name. That, as it were, is the limit above. But it is also that, not being able to fill life and therefore death with meaning, not having made room for the animal and the human, Heideggerian philosophy cannot be a philosophy of life, that is, it were, the limit from below. We must keep these earlier elaborations in mind when Derrida discusses Heidegger's refusal of evil to the animal, because evil is spiritual, geistlich. By Derrida's reading, I can suggest that we should now have to say of evil what Derrida says of spirit for the animal. The animal is poor in evil, bösarm as it is, geistarm as it were. It has evil, but does not have evil, and this not having is a mode of its being able to have evil. The discussion of the animal emerges in Of Spirit, in the wake of a typographical gesture, the crossing out. We may now be ready to read the passage about the fully Heideggerian text. To dream of what the Heideggerian corpus would look like the day when, with all the application and consistency required, the operation prescribed by him at one moment or another would indeed have been carried out. Avoid the word spirit. At the very least put it in quotation marks, then cross through all the names referring to the world whenever one is speaking of something which, like the animal, has no Dasein, and therefore no or only a little world. Then place the word being everywhere under a cross, and finally cross through without a cross all the question marks when it's a question of language, i.e. indirectly of everything else. One can imagine the surface of a text given over to the gnawing, ruminant, and silent veracity of such an animal machine and its implacable logic. This would not only be simply without spirit, but a figure of evil. Deconstruction, or destruction, cannot become a matter of obeying and applying an obsessive typography, of qualifying everything one reads, writes, or says, everything else. One must recall that these typographical gestures are ways of recalling limits that one cannot cross, rather than acting out theoretical safeguards against all previous philosophy. The spirit cannot be bound by politicizing in its name, but the Heideggerian philosophy cannot give itself over to its open animality either, and it has no typographical arsenal for recalling that limit. And therefore, since the paragraph I quote above is constructed by imitating the logic of dreamwork, it is that unprotected flank that provides the name of the text where every wish of a destructive philosophy is fulfilled. Everything you want to say is eaten up. The Nietzschean philosopher's self-modeling on the cud-chewing, ruminant cow goes out of control, not responsible before the spirit, but taken over, not by the animal, for it is out of reach, but by an animal machine that is crossed through before crossing through. Remember, the animal cannot be evil in this philosophy. Therefore, in the dream of its fulfillment, the surface of, the text controlled by the animal machine, is a figure of evil. To get the force of figure, I can once again return to Shibboleth, my vade mecum of responsible reading. This is an indictment of Heidegger's irresponsibility to, and in, philosophy, the irresponsibility of that philosophy from its powerful start. It is not the cop-out of philosophy good, man bad. An ex-Derridian said to me recently, Heidegger was a Nazi, and Jacques should have said it. This assumes that Derrida does deconstruction when he philosophizes, but turns it off when there's need for plain talk. It seems more responsible that, instead of falling back on the deceptive simplicity of a proposition, Heidegger was a Nazi, and taking that as a sufficient fulfillment of his philosophical responsibility, this philosopher, who has unceasingly deconstructed propositions, would philosophize with all stops pulled out, without denegating his complicity, to present Heideggerian philosophy as pharmakon, what could have been medicine turned to poison. It is not necessary to utter that proposition, after all. Heidegger simplified matters by taking out party membership. The liberal Euro-US academic, unceasingly complicitous with the test of exploitation, possibly endorsing child slavery every time she or he drinks a cup of tea, paying taxes to destroy survival ecobiomes of the world's poor, sometimes mouthing a Marxism liberal humanized out of existence, and talking no doubt against U.S. military aggression, profoundly irresponsible to the academic's one obligation of not writing on something carelessly read, cannot understand the complexity of this verdict. For them, the happy euphoria of being in the right, that their relation to dominant capital is not unlike deconstructions to Heidegger, and therefore involves responsibility, is not something they can arrive at through their own thinking, which will not open itself to what it resists. And they are certainly not willing to see if they are able to learn it through deconstruction. For them, deconstruction remains caught in the competition of whose sword is sharper. Of Spirit is concerned with philosophical argument, semantic content, rhetoric, and typography, all of which recalls limits, and all of which must remain open to setting to work. It is therefore noteworthy that the dream of the saturated Heideggerian corpus is not connected to an argument, but staged as a momentary and declared pause in square brackets in a long footnote about the markers and signs in Heidegger of imperceptible, for Martin Heidegger as much as for anyone, strata appearing prominent after the event, concerning an example more and other than an example, regarding the very origin of responsibilities, signs and markers that assign so many new tasks to thought and to reading, not only for reading Heidegger and serving some hermeneutical or philosophical piety, beyond an always necessary exegesis. This rereading sketches out another topology for new tasks, for what remains to be situated of the relationships between Heidegger's thought and other places of thought. In other words, the dream floats up where Derrida appears to be rescheduling his thought by way of his new politics of reading, which may seem to be a case of thought salvageable, man-limited. Trying to learn the silent dramaturgy of pragmatic signs in deconstruction in my own way over the years, I have followed a track of the markers and signs in Of Spirit, the dream work, as it were, to offer an unauthorized wild analysis. I cannot forget that Freud's main criticism of wild psychoanalysis was its irresponsibility, its ignoring of the robust response accountability structure of its transference. Is it simply this feeling of unease that makes me sense a familiar moment of unease in Derrida? He openly censures Heidegger for his disloyalty to Husserl, again in terms of irresponsibility to his own philosophy of crossing out. And the fact remains, beyond any possible contestation, that he didn't cross out this time, he erased, the dedication of Sein und Zeit to Husserl, so that the book could be republished in a gesture which reconstitutes the erasure as an unerasable, mediocre, and hideous crossing out. But in the same note, he points out, and to me as a product of imperialism, that this is a rare courage. He is even aware of the hierarchization and racism internal to an imperialist mindset. It is apparently necessary, therefore, in order to save the English dominions and power and culture they represent, to make a distinction between, for example, good and bad Indians. And this reference to spirit and to Europe is no more an external or accidental adornment of Husserl's thought than it is for Heidegger's. It plays a major organizing role in the transcendental teleology of reason as Europocentric humanism. The question of the animal is never very far away, just as man, and even the Papuan, my emphasis, represents a new stage in the animality in contrast to the animals, so philosophical reason represents a new stage in humanity and in its reason. Having pointed this out, Derrida engages in balancing two sides. Would Heidegger have thrown the non-Aryan out of Europe, as did he who knew he was himself non-Aryan, i.e. Husserl? And if the reply is no, to all appearances no, it is certain that this is for reasons other than those which distance him from transcendental idealism. Is what he did or wrote worse? It is then that I can hear unease. Where is the worst, le pire? That is, perhaps, the question of spirit. Why does he cite the title of his book there? In French, the demonstrative is even stronger. Voilà peut-être la question de l'esprit. It is not an exercise in judgment, weighing the good against the bad, cannot be, in a certain sense, a failure of the open-endedness of responsibility or the deconstructibility of justice. I cannot know, but I mark the moment. Let us return to the note of the animal machine. At the end of the dream pause, before marking the end, Derrida writes, "The perverse reading of Heidegger." Perverse, but possible, not idiosyncratic. The perverse reading. The article is not indefinite, and the French, la lecture perverse de Heidegger, even allows Heidegger's perverse reading. It may, of course, be said that Of Spirit attempts to converse with Heidegger, to turn him into the dark, perhaps perverse recesses of his philosophy as it juggles with spirit. It could take perverse in the colloquial sense and contrast it to Derrida's critique of the eminently sane supporters of the later Heidegger. Let us turn to the structuring of this long footnote, which deals precisely with the question, has the question been preserved in another form in the late Heidegger? The sentence this long note divides runs as follows. Language always, before any question, note reference, and in the very question, comes down to revient à the promise. The note glosses the thought of what is anterior to the question, and it prepares us to weigh the next sentence. This would be a promise of spirit. Let the reader work out the citing of the title of the book again, at this juncture where the promise, thought must obey it to be thought, is judged harshly against the question, thought must recall the responsibility to be answerable. In the footnote proper, Derrida lets texts of the later Heidegger lengthily point at the new pre-originary gauge, which engages the question in a responsibility it has not chosen and which assigns it even its liberty. But then he offers his own comment in tones of unmistakable emphasis. But it has to be admitted that the thought of an affirmation anterior to any question and more proper to thought than any question must have an unlimited incidence on the quasi-totality of Heidegger's previous path of thought. This step transforms or deforms, as you like, the whole landscape to the extent that the landscape has been constituted before, devant, the inflexible law of the most radical questioning. Let me recall that the point of departure of the analytic of Dasein, and therefore the project of Sein und Zeit itself, was assigned by the opening of Dasein to the question. Here Derrida again brings up Cartesian Hegelian subjectivity, and that the whole deconstruction of ontology took as its target, especially in post-Cartesian modernity, an inadequate questioning of the being of the subject, etc. This retrospective upheaval can now seem to dictate a new order, to construct a quite different discourse, open a quite different path of thought, and remove a highly ambiguous gesture, the remnant of Aufklärung, which still slumbered in the privilege of the question. I have encountered many uncomprehending readings of this text, particularly from readers who imitate the snaz without working on the intimidatingly precise argument. The point is, of course, that it is not an open denunciation, but the double bind of deconstructive responsibility practiced in the philosophizing, hard to shoulder, hard to recognize. But what is one responsible for? For the understanding and applause of impatient academics? I therefore take the liberty of recommending a slow reading of the next sentence. In fact, without believing that we can henceforth not take account of this profound upheaval, we cannot take seriously the imperative of such a recommencement. He gives his reasons, and it is after this that he proposes a new strategy, another topology, and strictly speaking, begins the last movement of Spirit, deconstructing Heidegger for his schoolmates. Those have learned that deconstruction is not exposure of error, but a new politics of reading. In the footnote, he says no more about any new strategy, although the text will henceforth and gradually declare his own deconstruction of Heidegger more and more, because my purpose bound me to privilege the modalities of avoiding, vermeiden, and notably the silent dramaturgy of pragmatic signs. Curiously enough, it is after this enigmatic sentence that the footnote pauses upon the dream of the full-dress production of the drama of pragmatic signs, a figure of evil, and this dream of a figure comes before the initial paragraphs of the footnote, which seem to admit that even in the later Heidegger, the proper of man arrives only in his response or this responsibility. Derrida is duty-bound to admit this, for, at the Essex Conference, Françoise Dastur reminded me of the passage of Unterwegs zur Sprache, which indeed passes question. I dedicate this note to her as a pledge of gratitude. A philosopher's responsibility is to acknowledge a counterexample to his general argument. In order to show, I think, that it is no more than a passage that passes question, that utters shibboleth with the correct accent, as it were, Derrida launches this elaborately orchestrated note to show further that the only way to respond to the thought of responsibility that Heidegger betrayed is to deconstruct deconstruction, another strategy. In keeping with the strategy of the deconstructive project, this chapter in the book has already begun to chip away at the identity of the man named Heidegger, first by constructing Trakl as Heidegger's ventriloquist upon Derrida's own contestory authority as follows. What is spirit? The reply is inscribed in the maxims which translate certain poetic statements by Trakl. For lack of time, I will have to restrict myself to the gross affirmation which I think is hardly contestable. Statements like those I have just cited and translated by Spirit in Flames are obviously statements of Heidegger, not productions of the subject Martin Heidegger. Next, Derrida undermines Heidegger's identity another degree by imposing the word revenant upon the Trakl Heideggerian stranger, whom the spirit follows on a journey that would permit an interpretation more ordinary than the origin and decadence currently in the dominant, i.e. metaphysico-Christian interpretation. His step carries him into the night, writes Derrida, like a revenant. Revenant is not a word of Heidegger's, and no doubt he would not like having it imposed on him because of the negative connotations, metaphysical or parapsychic, that he would be at pains to denounce it. I will not, however, efface it. There is no serious attempt to justify these impositions at this stage in the text, and in a couple of pages a crucial sentence will be divided by a long footnote we have read, which is to say, for lack of time I will make a gross affirmation. When one is looking forward to a beautifully shaped 7-page footnote, Martin Heidegger's authority is being deconstructed here, his text taken over or cathected by another strategy, a greater responsibility to a proper name. If Trakhl's statements are statements of Heidegger, what does it mean to say, as Derrida will in the next chapter, after a careful discussion of what origin heterogeneous, in place of the earlier position of the question of the origin, might mean in Heidegger? No, it is nothing. The final Heidegger, the gestures made to snatch Trakhl away from the Christian thinking of Geist seem to me laborious, violent, sometimes characteral, and not at all very convincing. It is with reference to an extremely conventional and doxical outline of Christianity that Heidegger can claim to de-Christianize Trakhl's Gedicht. What is origin heterogeneous would, in that case, be nothing other, but it's not nothing than the origin of Christianity, the spirit of Christianity, or the essence of Christianity. No, it's not nothing. The final Heidegger, is it the one with the proper name, is being delivered over to this very metaphysico-Christianity he mightily contested, and after this the book launches an exchange between Heidegger and his Christian apologists. Since I'm doing the questions and answers here, I imagine Heidegger's reply, each vying to claim the other's space, casually ecumenical. This Heidegger even accommodating the Judaic spirit, Ruah, with an I am opposing nothing, not even, I'd forgotten that one, the discourse on Ruah. I said it is on the basis of flame that one thinks pneuma or spiritus, or since you insist, Ruah, etc. Those Derrida, called theologians, had, in their turn, enthusiastically invoked my friend and co-religionary, the Messianic Jew. I'm not certain that the Muslim and some others, Heidegger's, etc., matches this, wouldn't join in the concert or the hymn. In this easy multicultural chat, a whitewashed Heidegger answers reproaches with, I follow the path of the entirely other. The call of the entirely other, to which one bears responsibility, and which the question recalls, has now been made into this. And crossing is not a neutral word, Derrida writes. It runs the risk of recalling the cross-shaped crossing through, under which one leaves being, l'être, or God to suffer. The crossing through itself is given over to the Christian metaphysics as Christ the man, Dasein, l'être is in lowercase, is crossed over on the cross as God under erasure. Perhaps I am speaking irresponsibly here, but this last movement of the book seems to me to confront European Christianity in its profound anti-Semitism, even in its self-consciously ecumenical prose. Indeed, introducing this last moment is a straightforward passage. One can, then, imagine a scene between Heidegger and a certain Christian theologian. It would be in truth an odd exchange. We are talking about past, present, and future events, a composition of forces and discourses which seem to have been waging merciless war on each other, for example from 1933 to our time. We have a combinatory whose power remains abyssal. In all rigor it exculpates none of the discourse which can thus exchange their power. It does not leave a clean place open, ne laisse la place nette, for any arbitrating authority. Nazism was not born in the desert. We all know this, but it has to be constantly recalled, and even if, far from any desert, it had grown like a mushroom in the silence of a European forest, it would have done so in the shadow of big trees, in the shelter of their silence or their indifference, but in the same soil. In their bushy taxonomy, they would bear the names of religions, philosophies, political regimes, economic structures, religious or academic institutions. In short, what is just as confusedly called culture, or the world of spirit. Whose power remains abyssal. The word abyssal combines both the nuances of the abyss and the interminable counter-reflection of the mise en abîme, the facing mirrors on the heraldic blason. The potentiality for something like Nazism, and I, quite without authority, would include here the demonization of the other peoples of the book, Islam, is always a possible potential in Christian Europe's cultural heritage. When, at the end of the book, we read that the only hope is the shuttle of dialogue, it's enough to keep talking, not to interrupt, we cannot forget the grim description of such exchanges in the passage above. The imagined exchange between the final Heidegger and his contemporary interlocutors can achieve nothing, and Of Spirit ends with a deliberate disregard of Heidegger's philosophical cautions, even as a parody of Heidegger's first principle is offered. The spirit will do the rest. But this spirit is a ghost. There is an interesting printer's error in the translation, almost as if the translators cannot brook such irreverence. It is in flame as well as in ash, and it is unavoidable. In this version of Spirit, Martin Heidegger and the question dead end in this shuttle, a caricature of the response structure of responsibility. The deconstruction of Heidegger has taken off elsewhere, following the track of a responsibility Heidegger himself gave up, halfway to its testing in its setting to work. One must learn to read in order to see it happen, to respond to the argument. This is not the conflation of literature and philosophy, it is the use of the resources of writing to philosophize. This unauthorized formalization of the silent dramaturgy of Spirit is no more than an intermediary stage. I want now to offer another instantiation of what I have learned from this text of responsibility, the animal machine of fully programmed information, and a European combinatory whose power remains abyssal, so that the two sides seem to engage in an interminable conversation while a spectre does the rest. I am, of course, miming a progression of images rather than, strictly speaking, following an argument. Is this responsible to the text? But concept and metaphor are in each other. 3. Conference on the Flood Action Plan, FAP, in Bangladesh, European Parliament, Strasbourg. I do not read here the silent dramaturgy of pragmatic signs that convention considers decadent to read, because it is nothing but the transparent scaffolding that supports the text of reason. I read, rather, the dramaturgy of the apparently unrehearsed staging of what convention regards to be the transparent textuality or theater of facts. I rush in to supplement where Derrida postpones. And as, since the beginning of this lecture, we have been speaking of nothing but the translation of these thoughts and discourses into what are commonly called the events of history and of politics, I place quotation marks around all these obscure words, it would also be necessary to translate what such an exchange of places can imply in its most radical possibility. This translation appears to be both indispensable and for the moment impossible. The moment in that last sentence may be standing in for the definitely differential prow of the present on the move. But I literalize. I aim to sidle into the parentheses to see what script puts quotation marks around these obscure words in another text, not only translated from Europe, but transferred, yet remaining the same. I read the unfolding of a small conference arranged by the Green Party at the European Parliament. So much has been written about the relationship between orators and rhetors that it seems unnecessary to belabor the point. Derrida himself has written on the elaboration of that topic in Rousseau. The parliamentary setting with its representatives, who must vertreten, represent, rather than darstellen, represent, has also been exposed by Marx by way of a sustained theatrical metaphor. What is also surely obvious is the monumentalized role that the delicate and irregular beat of responsibility as accountability plays here. The members are responsible to their constituency. Derrida has indirectly written about the conventions of the representation of the public, to whom the representative is responsible, in Call It a Day for Democracy. Let us also remember the other, slightly odder sense given to responsibility, the transference of responses volleyed from one subject to another, drawn by a mise en abîme. There is a mise en scène of this in the structuring of a parlement, the place where men, typically, reason together. Let us add to this that the conference was arranged by a group with a representative in Parliament that feels responsible to nature, animals, as well as a world worlded as earth, as the other of the human, a group self-consciously responsible for the picking back up of the abdicated responsibility of human on earth, as it were, and representative of those who have called this responsibility, those human beings who are fully human at last. It may, I think, be said that they speak in the name of spirit against technologism and capitalism. Does this reinscribing of spirit in an oppositional demarcation make a unilaterality of subjectivity, and how terrifying is the contamination? If at an academic conference one's ostensible responsibility is firstly to truth, secondly to oneself, since it is oneself who must represent, and thirdly to the audience, to whom one must communicate, and all those have, as we know, their attendant practico-philosophical problems, a conference with registered participants, who are, in such a situation, Rousseauistically called participants, where the obligation of the speaker is to represent a specific national perspective through international concern, as they are arranged at a facing space, carries the representation Darstellung of direct responsibility, as if Vertretung, into a certain abyssality. By borrowing from the resources of the theater, resources that are freely discussed in the planning and recognized in the event even as they are automatically dismissed by protocol. This last awkward sentence must be given the flesh and blood of empirical detail, but there is yet another codicil to be added to the account of how political and human responsibility was, in this case, bound to a structure. And the very thought of the codicil calls for a caution. There can be no assumption that pure responsibility can appear unstructured and unstaged. The call is a gift, but the response is, unavoidably, an exchange effect. This is the stimulus of a persistent critique, which must forever try to maintain the precarious balance between construction and deconstruction, construction and deconstruction. The codicil, then, the entire set described in the text, was staged as a dialogue between the forces of development and the voices of a developing nation, charging the developers with constructing a theater of responsibility to disguise the mechanics of unrestricted capital investment. Dialogue is, in fact, the accepted proper name of responsibility as exchange of responses, implicitly understood as the flow of propositions or contestations rather than responses from both sides. It is a word given status and currency by the participatory movements in the 60s that have displaced themselves in the new social movements of the 70s and 80s, of which the European Green Party is an inheritor. I have already indicated a possible scenario of responsibility that can be constructed out of a party's presuppositions broadly understood. This other feature, the implementation of that responsibility through dialogue, is the translation of the presupposition into technique. The thinking of the relationship, or non-relationship, or relationship, between justice and law, inaugurated by the force of law, inevitably determines my understanding of the relationship between responsibility and dialogue. For I think it is right to say in that word, in this particular Anglo-US usage, the false etymology of dia, as the two that converse, mingles with the original sense of something coming about through the telling, the middle voice of dialgesthe, mingling also with telling as in a calculus. But let this remain a parenthesis, for to dwell on this would restrain us from the empirical narrative. Yet, let it be said that the often repugnant and smug congratulation that the inclusion of empirical narrative brings to an academic in the humanities is even less productive when accompanied by such musings. Indeed, the conference was organized for the establishment of a dialogue. The word dialogue and confrontation, about whose relationship to responsibility much could be written, was repeatedly used in the conference literature precisely as that phenomenon the establishment of which would be the first step towards the restoration of responsibility. Let me quote a sentence that will highlight the justice/law, responsibility/dialogue route that must be taken as given in order to decide, necessarily, in the night of non-knowledge. The legal basis for public consultation and people's participation must be ensured first in order to have meaningful dialogue with the World Bank. I am speaking of a conference that has been described in the following way. In a victory for Green Party activists from France, Germany, and the Netherlands, the European Parliament will host an unprecedented open debate of the merits of the FAP, May 26th and 27th, 1993, where project opponents will have an opportunity to present their case directly to many of the governments funding the scheme. Let me give the bare bones of the situation. If Derrida had been obliged to give gross affirmations for lack of time, I am obliged to summarize, because I can expect no familiarity with the background of development in the readership of deconstruction. Bangladesh is a small fertile country, continually in the making by the play of huge young rivers. These young rivers rise in the neighboring countries and gather force until they reach Bangladesh on their way to the Bay of Bengal. They deposit enormous quantities of silt as their waters divide into innumerable tributaries as they reach the open bay. It is quite like the way the great blood vessels finally break into capillaries to disperse into the skin. The entire country, apart from the mountains to the north and the east, is thus soft alluvial deposit, and the coast is a collection of many small, shifting deltas covered by mangrove swamps. Because these rivers are young and strong, they move. When the Brahmaputra River is at maximum flood, for example, bed forms up to 15 meters high migrate downstream as much as 600 miles a day. Lateral channel movements as high as 800 miles a year are common. Many experts consider the confinement of such rivers to be impossible. This is also one of the world's most earthquake-prone locations. An active fault line along the northern edge of the delta at the foothills of the Himalayas. The largest earthquake on land known to seismologists, registering 8.7 on the Richter scale, occurred in this region in 1897. Witnesses reported that the quake caused plumes of water to gush from the ground. In areas of recent sand and silt deposition with high water tables, such as the Bengal Delta, earthquakes lead to liquefaction, the temporary loss of strength of sands and silts, which behave like viscous fluids rather than soils. It may be said only half fancifully that the grounding of the ground is evident here as one thinks from the worlded world. What is crossed out has already been and is being crossed out by the moving weave of water. At Bangladesh, the land mass of the Indian subcontinent narrows, and the Himalaya is squeezed up into its highest peaks. Thus the monsoon winds here travel much longer over ocean and sea, gather force in the incopious width of the Bay of Bengal, and dash more quickly at a much higher mountain wall. It is a country of great rains. In this combination of turbulent flowing and pouring, keep the distinction in mind for later, the Bangladeshi fisherfolk and grassroots peasants have been used to living with water, even yearly flooding, forever. Every 30 years or so, there are devastating floods. They have learned to bear this, not quite to cope with the extraordinary inundations, but to bend with them and to rise again. As for the yearly floods, they have learned to manage them, welcome them, and build a lifestyle with respect for them. Indeed, the moving floodwaters leave algae that alleviate the need to fertilize, and Bangladesh notionally produces enough food to feed the entire population. I must keep to the point of the essay, and therefore cannot speak to the internal class exploitation and the lack of interest in land reform. I will touch upon this later in this essay. The Bangladeshis' main source of protein is fish. The grassroots fisher catches fish in the rivers and waters that are still common property. On my level of miming the logic of the concept metaphor, it is absurd to ask if the relationship between Dasein, animal world, is different here from Heidegger lizardstone. It is in the context of the flood action program in Bangladesh that I begin to get my kind of handle on Derrida's obstinate insistence in the face of learned participants in his seminar who cited Heideggerian passages apparently to the contrary, that Heidegger never speculated on eating, and his equally insistent refrain, what is it to eat? If, in a certain conventional theology, to eat God's flesh is to establish exchange with spirit, what is established by eating mere flesh or fish? Is the argument on the fetish, contrasting the two, akin to the humanist teleology of Heidegger's Christian metaphysics in the differentiation between Dasein and the animal? When the anthropologist learnedly transforms the racist language of the fetish into the scientific discourse of the totem, how much by subreption, in constant analytic of the sublime, does the psychoanalytic set sublimate all of this from real castration to circumcision as recalling the fear of castration, so that the self-conscious superegoic sense of responsibility, recognizable as such, takes quite another form? How does the ecology of fish-eating, in the geology of turbulent, youthful rivers, transform the eating of sacrificial flesh in Islam, of which these circumcised subalterns are devoutly observant in season, as far as means will allow? Because these people are poor, they are not human enough for philosophizing on the basis of their lives, as did Heidegger, starting from the generally human. Especially if they occupy Derrida's question to Heidegger, what is it to eat, from a position that is not quite fetish/totem, yet marked by sacrifice and circumcision? How does the question of woman complicate each of these categories? Has Heidegger ever been faulted because today's Bavarian grassroots may not think as he does? but I am dragged out beyond my summary of the problematic of woman fish water. Let us resume. In 1988, there was a disastrous flood, one of the 3 expected in a century. It is alleged that Danielle Mitterrand, who was in the country at the time, spoke of the devastation to her husband. Of course, she knew nothing of what has been summarized so far. And Francois Mitterrand, ironically his name means middle landowner, a traditional small-time class exploiter of the common property landless grassroots, decided to make flood control in Bangladesh the centerpiece of the Third World Aid at the Paris Summit. FAP, Flood Action Plan 25, the first French plan, is an allegory of the right reason, figure 1, to impose upon the changeful riverscape the straight lines of massive pharaohaic embankments is the plan. Just over $10 billion are being circulated to generate further capital according to the changeful laws of the International Monetary Fund. The governments of the group of 7 countries are involved as donor countries. If dialogue bears a mark, so does donor. Who deserves that appellation? Who gives or can give? The gift is a limit that permits and annuls all recognizable human giving. But here, far from that limit, the name of giving is scientifically appropriated for coercive lending, solicited by comprador capital and a compromised state, used as staging props for a nation seeking aims. Is responsibility to be produced by a debt trap? This monstrosity, a bonded donation, mortgages the future of the country. I foolishly read philosophy as blueprint here. Know still what giving means, veut dire, literally wants to say. Know how to give. Know what you want and mean. Veut dire literally wants to say. When you give, know what you intend to give. Know how the gift annuls itself. Commit yourselves. Engagez-toi. Literally stake yourself. Even if commitment is the destruction of the gift by the gift, give economy a chance. The World Bank coordinates the effort, shored up by innumerable business enterprises and consultancies and government allocations and international agencies. The country is consultanized. The possibility of agitation for people's rights effectively blocked, since the de facto law is in the hands of the donors via a flood protection coordinating organization set up by executive decision of the Ministry of Water Development, which describes itself as an ad hoc staff body directed by the donors' own policy requirements. There is, in other words, no accountability here. It is not conceivable that some first world consulting agency will, first, be tracked down after the organization has been dismantled, and second, respond at the subaltern's call. In other words, the element of legal calculus of one sort in the name of a collectivity of individuals conceived in terms of tirelessly gathered details of life and living has been blocked. The certainty that justice always eludes these calculations makes it all the more important that their possibility be sustained. It is just that there be law. We must recall that development is the dominant global denomination of responsibility. The story is that the rich nations collectively hear the call of the ethical and collect to help the poor nations by giving skill and money. There are, therefore, elaborate and visible structures of public consultation in place. The ways in which these structures are manipulated, well-publicized occasions of exchange that are minimally disseminated or not disseminated at all, promises that are made without intention of performance, pure performatives, and in-house decisions not to honor the result of consultation, being only a few, can be documented. It was to redress the imbalance between structural rights and the possibility of their exercise that the European Green Party called the most public meeting it could devise. Knowing that responsibility, in its setting to work, can never reduce out the unilaterality of subjectivity, we still compute how the form of complicity of the Green Party and the World Bank, shorthand for all the parties involved in the FAP, are not equivalent. Undoubtedly, these are 2 European ways of helping the people of Bangladesh. For the World Bank, the people is the name of the final instance of justification for its enterprise. The justification, always crudely formulated, is a parody of Marx's conclusion, based on Victorian Britain, the herald of modern imperialism, that capitalism maximizes social productivity. Marx was involved in working out how the interest of capitalism could be diverted from capital to the social, how poison could be measured into medicine. I have discussed elsewhere how the concept metaphor of the social betrayed Marx. The thought of responsibility can come to supplement that betrayal. The World Bank is not involved in the diversion of interest from capital to social. The people, rather far from Marx's tough nationalist definition of the social, remain a promised possible beneficiary of the trickle-down from capital-intensive social productivity. The real interest remains the generation of global capital through consultant and contractor. The World Bank does not merit the deconstructive reading and supplementation that Marx's attempt commands. We owe it no such responsibility. It falls far short of the call. The Green Party as such, on the other hand, whatever the sympathies of individual members, does not act in the name of the people as the last instance. Their last instance is nature, even though it is always nature for the human, as the human for nature. Here, we can take all the precautions against imagining that nature can ever be anything but that which comes back after and before the human. This said, we can now notice that the elaborate dramaturgy of the Parliament conference structure of responsibility/representation keeps the party on the other side of the subaltern as well. Yet we certainly will not consider this distance equivalent to the rapacious double talk of the World Bank. One can act politically to make the distinction clear. Thus, somewhat haphazardly, selected members of the Bangladeshi opposition to the FAP responded positively to the party's call, but they felt it inappropriate to sign the resolution drawn up for the support of the Bangladeshi people by interested members of the European community. One might think that pointing out this complicity between the party and the bank is enough proof of a combinatory whose power remains abyssal. These are two faces of Europe, after all, global and bloated, earthy and ascetic. But one must note, once again, the former's formal refusal of responsibility, even as exchange. The following principals sent belated letters of refusal to the invitation to the conference, pleading an indefinite obligation. J.I.M. Dempster, Panel of Experts, Fritz Fischer, German Executive Director, World Bank, M.H. Siddiqui, Chief Engineer, Floodplain Coordination Organization, Ministry of Water, blah, 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 long list of names. I have been advised not to participate, and as a consequence, I have to decline your invitation. The World Bank's Water Resources Advisor, Asia Region, W.T. Smith, provided the curtest refusal. I regret I will not attend, since I am not currently involved in the FAP. The monumental structure of any conference attempts to control the turbulent flow of new and old thought in the name of intellectual professional responsibility. Let us attempt to draw an analogy between this and the nature of the flood action plan. I have already indicated the broad similarity. The monumental pharaonic concrete hard structures are built in an attempt to control the turbulent young waters of the great rivers. We will see at the end how both, though not in equivalent ways, serve to silence the subaltern. But now let us take the analogy in another direction. Let us think of these stupendous drains, driving the continually shifting textile waters by the violence of reason into the shortest route to the sea as the violence of reason itself, driving the continually differentiating text lie of meanings into the shortest route to truth. But the absolute fulfillment of these drained dreams and their attendant systems would be the perverse dream of reason against that principle of reason which is obliged to give an account of itself, fulfilled in every detail for itself, an animal machine with all inconsistencies programmed, the land reduced to whatever can be fed into geographical informational systems, its surface given over to that ruminant knowing. This implacable logic began with the systematizing of land into survey in early modern Britain, the condition and effect of conquest and imperialism. The worlding of infinite geometries for control of the country as information is its working out. It is in the interest of that culture fishery, projected as a replacement for the capture of fish, moving with flood and moving water as common property, will systematize the bounded rivers into private property and export, and establish the systemization of agri-capital. This is a dream that requires the land of unconnected monetary pause, that a deconstructive censor lets slip in that long footnote of spirit. Nazism, which showed the risk of destruction literalized, was ostensibly defeated, although the demonization of Islam and the progressively militant xenophobia in Europe and the United States give proof that the big trees in the European, by Husserl's expanded definitions of Europe, forest that sheltered Nazism can still be, however confusedly, called culture or the world of spirit. This dream, the animal machine of exploitation fully transforming land into information for a manipulation that will obey a myriad minute rules of programming, also belongs to that culture, that spirit, in the name of reason, the public use of reason, white mythology. It is the subaltern, the fisher, and the grassroots peasant who produces a constant interruption for the full telos of reason and capitalism for those who have the patience to learn. I will tax my readers' patience with one example among many. Living in the rhythm of water, the Bangladeshi peasant long sowed two types of rice paddy seed. One of them survived submerged in water, the other came to full growth after the season of rain and flood. In 1971, agricultural reformers introduced a different variety of rice for a single high-yield crop. In the intervening years, the peasant has quietly and gradually shifted the time of his sowing of this modern crop to Falgun Chiatro, February-March. As was their established custom, accommodating the play of land and water, they now sow pulses and vegetables before this. And now, at the reaping time of the new crop, the old flood seed is sown, so that in the rain and flood time the fields are once again full of that submersible paddy. By contrast, the land protected from water by the embankments loses the fertilizing algae, thus providing an opportunity for the enhancement of the debt trap and the destruction of the ecobiome by the peddling of chemical fertilizers. I hesitate to call this silent interruption flood management, by exporting a metaphor of nature as the great laboratorium, the arsenal which furnishes both means and material of labor, coming from what is confusedly called European culture, producing an evolutionary constant, an account. I hesitate to denominate the responsible deconstruction, learning critique from within, leading to a new setting to work, as in Derrida's reading of Heidegger, as technology transfer, as a gift from a superior civilization. Count this interruption in the nature of a permanent parabasis, the peasant's rather than the philosopher's disarticulated rhetoric, a setting to work, not an explication of the philosopher's dream. Ask the question again, what exactly does the fulfilled dream of reason bring about on its way? If the subaltern offers us, say, learning, and the ecological deconstructor supplements this with the persistently intermediary stage of its transformation into exchangeable but internalized knowledge, not merely knowledge of knowledge, the murderous supplement of the animal machine bypasses the implication of responsibility with subjectivity, even freedom of intention, and substitutes information command. This figure of evil continues the work of imperialism by destroying what is, no doubt confusedly, called culture, in this case a popular culture, traditional learning and knowledge, traditional agronomic patterns, and, what I have left until last, the traditional pattern of subaltern women's freedom on the impermanent floating islands or cores. In place of the destroyed culture of learning, a continually expanded amount of money continues to be spent on the aid debt model to collect hydrological data as if nothing had been known. A large section of the postcolonial subjects of Bangladesh is, of course, crazy about geographical information systems, and not in the service of accountable reasons. They provide the European interminable dialogists the opportunity to invoke the Bangladeshis as the willing beneficiaries, just as the interminable dialogists at the end of Spirit had invoked the Messianic Jew and the Muslim. The question or affirmation about the intractable agency of the spectre is left open at the end of Spirit, since its textual function is nothing more and nothing less than the transcription of spirit as ghost. Derrida has written elsewhere on the spectrality in connection with Marx. Is it possible to imagine that, since responsibility must bind the call of the ethical to a response, that one must act here as if responsibly to the spectre called communism, whose threat development must desperately hold at bay? That setting to work need not call on a European left monoculture. This space of intimate learning of human-animal watery ground is, after all, an ongoing response to the weave of land and river by the landless and uncommon waters. Nothing but an intermediary question can be posed and left suspended in the space of an essay. Because we have less power than the World Bank, and because some of us are of color, when we confront the World Bank, we sometimes claim that the subaltern speaks. Also, as I have indicated before, if an academic includes empirical details in her essays, joins demonstrations, participates in international conferences with political-sounding titles, and engages in solidarity tourism, we think of her as an activist. Such assumptions might be put in their place by the fact that 1. The World Bank took little notice of the organized protests at the conference, and 2. In order to locate the subaltern, the heterogeneous collection of subjects in the space of difference, from the two Europes, and from those who can protest a conference at a parliament, we will have to cross other frontiers. This conference was, however, an intermediary stage of strategic and tactical setting to work that involved a range from heads of the donor states all the way down to the low-level functionaries of the client state, people involved, directly and indirectly, in making decisions and implementing them, decisions not always made in the night of non-knowledge and affecting the subaltern. To address one above concretely, I cite extracts from an internal memo circulated by the Deputy Director of the Environmental Department of the World Bank. This is his answer to the question, what happened at the conference. There must have been 30 to 40 Bangladeshis present, all seemingly opposing FAP, with a smaller group of about 6, who were official speakers. These, I understood from Ross Wallace, are the standard characters appearing at all the FAP events in Dhaka. They are, as you know, extremely articulate and complement each other very well. Professor Shapan Adnan gives the fact great detail. Kushi Kabir gives a sociological perspective, giving emphasis to the income distributional and women's issues. Ms. Kabir had in fact been surprisingly silent about women this time. Dr. Hashemi, a very sympathetic person I thought, gives the economic. Mohideen Farouk presents the legal questions, a very nice fellow but doesn't make much sense, and a young woman, Mushrifa Mishu, who is president of the Student Unity Forum, gives the passionate anti-colonial, anti-establishment stuff which the adults wouldn't get away with. This is a silencing of protest, of course. Anti-imperialist discourse is put in its place with cynical flippancy. In case the World Bank should be obliged to back down, the protest might mean something after all, as they were in the case of Narbana Valley Project in India, March 1993. A formula for recoding defeat as victory is given in advance. A clear statement from the bank on the size and composition of the program emerging from the regional studies could perhaps help position us better from an external relations standpoint, although perhaps not with the government. Absent that, the opposition will strengthen in Europe and possibly in the US, and if a year from now a much more modest program does emerge, the NGOs, presumably Bangladeshi, will claim victory. This makes it clear that the interminable exchange is indeed between Europe and Europe. The others can be dismissed as poor players, a stale act. But we must also note that the issue is how to claim responsibility for a victory, to stage recapitulation in such a way that it looks like responsible response to reasoned inquiry. All responsibility is a simulacrum of responsibility, perhaps, but all complicities with this necessity are not equivalent, and what Derrida has said, with justified irritation, about those who respond to responsibility with the cant of the centered subject, is nothing compared to what can be said to those who act out the reasoned responsibility of Europe to the people of the rest of the world in the interest of the self-determination of international capital. Whence comes the law that forbids one to forgive whoever does not know how to give? I saw then clearly that his aim had been to do a good deed, while at the same time making a good deal, to earn 40 cents and the heart of God, to win paradise economically. In short, to pick up gratis, the certificate of a charitable man. To be mean is never excusable, but there is some merit in knowing that one is. The most irreparable of vices is to do evil out of stupidity. The first of 7 broad points, to which the Deputy Director of Environment reduces the myriad grumbles about FAP, is that the talk about participation is just that, talk. There is no genuine effort on the part of anyone to ask the rule poor what they think or want. It is to be noted that no remedy is indicated for this problem anywhere in the memo. No genuine effort can, of course, be made by the programming dream of the perfect animal machine to accommodate the singular rhythm of the human-animal water. And on the mundane register, it is absurd to think that the ethical rhythm of responsive transference with the Bangladeshi subaltern can ever become the necessary but impossible goal for the functionaries and associates of the World Bank. The infinite care with which Derrida had compiled a list of the duties of the new Europe, and then reminded the self-same Europe that a list of quite other duties silently supposes it, can never become a part of the bank's investment in development. The point is, however, that even when the bank is questioned by the representatives of a Europe that is responsible to the human being in nature, the subaltern is silenced. In conclusion, a few hints. The feasibility of sane technology transfer by building on traditional flood management methods was elaborated with care and precision by the president of the International Rivers Network based in Berkeley. No one but the Bangladeshis knew that in the overlong Bengali speech of Abdus Sattar Khan, an aging leader of the peasant movement, this flood management technique and the detailed account of all major rivers in Bangladesh was given in an old-fashioned pejorative way. I am not romanticizing this particular person. He is not a great leader, and is apparently not specifically associated with the mobilization against the Flood Action Plan. I certainly do not know enough about him to credit him with authenticity, simply because, in that company of card-carrying international activists and development officials, he seemed a guileless old man. But there can be little doubt that he was staged as a slice of the authentic, a piece of the real Bangladesh. If the World Bank's internal memo represents the silencing of protest, the misfiring of the staging of this elderly man is also a species of silencing. The way the shape of his words escaped the monumental structuring of the theater of old Europe, which determined the dialogue, was pathetically trivial. But even here we are not in the register of the speech of everyday frustration of the quietly flood-managing fisher and farmer with the incomprehensible giant systematically destroying their established rhythm of existence. It is often forgotten that the persuasive accomplices of the World Bank are, in appearance, well-meaning, educated Bangladeshis extending help to these subalterns. The first impulse that comes from below is of trust in responsibility. And indeed, Sattar Khan had come to the conference trusting that his old-fashioned, fact-filled speech against the FAP would be heard. And although in his case the trust was not in principle misplaced, there was such a great gulf fixed between his own perception of how to play his role in the theater of responsibility and the structure into which he was inserted, that there was no hope for a felicitous performance from the very start. In order to hear him, Europe would need him to represent responsibility, by reflex, in Europe's way. In other words, he would have had to change his mindset. That is how the old colonial subject was shaped. When we do it, we call it education. To begin with, the European Parliament had no provision for simultaneous translation from the Bengali. In the event, an imperfect English translation was read out of sync by a Bangladeshi who was participating in, the conference, and it was this imperfect, well-meaning amateur production that was available through the headphones in simultaneous translation in the other conference languages. For the first time, the hall was full of impatient hubbub. European discipline was breaking down. The man's style, practiced by a lifetime of subcontinental popular oratory, another theater that Kipling was already mocking in the 19th century, declaimed with now ridiculous passion to an absent audience. The Bangladeshis present from a younger, more professional generation swung between embarrassment and sympathy. Of course, Sattar Khan's paper far exceeded the 20 allotted minutes. In the monumental structuring we inhabit, the exceeding of allotted time is negotiable and depends on gender, status, and the temperament of the moderator. In this case, the benevolent, egalitarian young U.S. moderator cut the speaker off. Sattar Khan responded in generally incomprehensible Bengali with a "Friend, I am a poor peasant," which was not, strictly speaking, the case, but under the circumstances a fair rhetorical representation, and, I have no doubt, infinitely more effective in those simulacra of parliamentarism that we encounter in former colonies, where the battle is between who is and is not a colonial subject, rather than on the grounds of cultural difference. You must hear me out. Therefore, he was, of course, allowed to continue by way of a gesture of benevolence towards someone who could not understand the rules. He read then at a breakneck speed, and the entire ad hoc effort at translation collapsed. This incident can only stand in for the subaltern's inability to speak. For Mr. Sattar, a middle-class peasant party leader, was far indeed from the landless peasant and that grassroots fisher, however indigenous he was by contrast with the other participants. It stands in successfully, however, by virtue of the fact that the subaltern's inability to speak is predicated upon an attempt to speak, to which no appropriate response is proffered. It is, in fact, an attempt to speak, and in fact a failure of responsibility in the addressee that can be reckoned irrespective of the fact that all communication is infected by désinhérence. In 1991, before I had read Of Spirit, I had written as follows about the subaltern inhabitants of the cyclone and tidal wave-prone southeast coast of Bangladesh. If this was an ecologic, where the unlikely material subject was the pulse of the tide and the rhythm of the waterlogging of the wind, I was in no way ready, daily encountering these people's very savvy discussions of the U.S. task force, simply to narrativize them as an earlier pre-scientific stage where the proper help was to control nature so that these people could be redefined as passive. What would it be to learn otherwise here? Better offer the contradiction. They will not move except as unwilling refugees. I could respect the relief workers' bemused on-the-spot decision that this other kind of resistance to rehabilitation must not be allowed to develop into an aporia. But the vestiges of intellectual sophistication I possessed saw with distaste the long-distance theorist's dismissal of the aporia as anachrony, or his embracing of it as the saving grace of achrony. I was adrift. This unwillingness to leave the land is rather easily accounted for by the good Europeans, as a justified fear on the part of the poor that they will be deprived of the land by evacuating, or increasing lack of waged work in rural areas. I am not satisfied with so easy a reasoning. Was there no lesson there to learn at all? Then, is the subaltern transparent? This may seem inconsequential to the reader, but it is precisely this type of uncaring damning of a drift that marks Heidegger's generalization of the animal. There is, according to the view I am discussing here, no gauge of intention but rational expectations, logical self-interest, reason written by something confusedly called European common sense. The subaltern mental theater is no bigger than this, just as for population control, the subaltern female is nothing but a crotch. There is something like a relationship between this and the perverse dream of fulfilled reason, although all complicities are not equivalent. No doubt these easy generalities come out of exchange with local people, sometimes through relayed networking, rightly perceived as a contrast to the World Bank's structured alibi for consultation with the subaltern. Yet the complicity is in that abyssal power of European exchange, for responsibility is still traduced here by impatience and inattention. I will close with an example of the silent gnawing of such a betrayal. In Birth of a Megaproject, James Boyce, an authoritative witness against irresponsible development, claims that the Bengali language distinguishes between the normal beneficial floods of the rainy season, which are termed barsha, and the harmful floods of abnormal depth and timing, which are termed bona. The English word flood conflates these two very different phenomena. The sources cited are Bangladeshi. Boyce's observation is repeated in a number of subsequent Western articles. I am presuming that Boyce is the source of this. His interpretation of the information is incorrect, in a way common to genuine but anthropologistic Euro-US benevolence, as someone hearing people use "see you later" and "see you soon" interchangeably should claim for the English language a profound philosophy of time, where soon and later were identical. Professor M. Aminul Islam, who is cited by Dr. Paul, Boyce's direct source, writes as follows. In all the three study villages, flooding is referred to as Barsha and Bona. This idiosyncratic construction carries a trace of the names of two different kinds of times, perhaps. Barsha, June-October, is a normal inundation and is taken as a benevolent agent. Bona is perceived as disastrous. Neither of these native Bengali speakers is making a claim for Bengali, or indeed many North Indian languages, where Barsha, Sanskrit versa, a normal construction from the verbal root vers, meaning roughly to drop down, means rain or rainy season. What they are claiming is that in their study area and in ecologically similar areas, when the subaltern says the rains, he includes a certain normal inundation. If time and historical circumference had obliged the English speakers to take as much trouble with Bengali as a foreign linguist has to do with European languages in order to venture a remark about meaning in a published prose about the general language, this authoritative comment on Bengali would not have been offered. And I am not speaking of High Bengali either, but of the mother tongue spoken by the illiterate expert of flood management. Monthlies and bleeding are not good and bad words for bleeding in the English language. In the context of this waterborne land, still in the making in the rough theater of mountain and wind, the strict differentiation between rain and flood, fixed in the Indo-European mindset, is persistently deconstructed, the one implying the other. When the balance is disturbed so that the opposition begins to come clear again, the signification is disaster. However sympathetic the intention to rob the mother tongue of the subaltern by way of an ignorant authoritative definition that is already becoming part of the accepted benevolent lexicography is the most profound silencing. These words, too many, can only point you towards such silences.